Before doctors had microscopes, before scientists knew what germs were, and long before anyone could walk into a pharmacy for medicine, disease was one of the greatest mysteries in human life. Imagine waking up one morning in an ancient village. The sun is rising. The animals are making noise. Someone is baking bread nearby. Everything seems normal. Then, by evening, your neighbor develops a fever. A few days later, several people are sick. A week later, some are dead. No one knows why. There are no laboratory tests, no scans, no blood work, no internet search telling you that your symptoms match a common infection. In fact, nobody even knows that tiny organisms called bacteria and viruses exist. To ancient people, disease often seemed to appear out of nowhere, like an invisible enemy wandering through the village. And honestly, if you had no idea what germs were, you might come up with some pretty strange explanations too. Many ancient societies believed illness came from angry gods. If crops failed, if floods arrived, or if people became sick, it could be seen as punishment from powerful forces above. In ancient Egypt, disease was often linked to supernatural causes. Priests sometimes acted as healers, combining practical treatments with prayers and rituals. A patient might receive herbal medicine and spiritual protection at the same time. If you're thinking that sounds like covering all possible options, you're probably right. In ancient Mesopotamia, people often believed evil spirits caused sickness. If someone became ill, special rituals might be performed to drive away whatever unseen force was responsible. The logic made sense from their point of view. After all, something invisible was clearly hurting people. They were just a few thousand years away from discovering exactly what that invisible thing actually was. The ancient Greeks eventually began searching for more natural explanations. One of the most famous figures in early medicine was the Greek physician Hippocrates. Rather than blaming angry gods for every illness, he suggested that disease had physical causes within the body. This was a major step forward. Of course, some of his ideas were not exactly correct. Hippocrates believed the body contained 4 important fluids, known as the humors: blood, yellow bile, black bile, and phlegm. According to this theory, people became sick when these fluids fell out of balance. If you had too much of one humor or too little of another, illness followed. Today this sounds unusual, but at the time, it was one of the most advanced medical theories in the world. For centuries, doctors would continue using this idea. Sometimes they even tried removing blood from patients to restore balance. As you might imagine, if someone is already weak and sick, taking away some of their blood does not always improve the situation. Still, medicine was progressing even if it occasionally took a few wrong turns. The Romans later adopted many Greek medical ideas. Throughout the vast territories of the Roman Empire, physicians treated patients using herbs, diets, exercise, and various medical procedures. Roman cities also built impressive systems for clean water and sanitation. Aqueducts carried fresh water across long distances. Public baths were common. Sewage systems helped remove waste. Interestingly, while the Romans did not understand germs, some of their practical habits actually reduced disease. Sometimes people can make a good decision without fully understanding why it works. Meanwhile, in ancient China, medical traditions developed along a different path. Chinese healers viewed health as a balance between different forces within the body and the natural world. Treatments often included herbal remedies, acupuncture, and careful observation of symptoms. Many of these practices evolved over centuries and remain influential even today. In India, medical knowledge also flourished through systems that emphasized balance, diet, and natural treatments. Ancient physicians carefully recorded symptoms and experimented with remedies made from plants and minerals. Across the world, people were trying their best to understand illness using the knowledge available to them. The problem was that the true causes remained hidden. A person could drink contaminated water and become sick days later. Another might catch a disease from someone standing only a few feet away. But because germs are invisible, these connections were extremely difficult to recognize. Without modern science, disease often seemed random. One family survived. Another family next door did not. One village escaped an outbreak. Another was devastated. This uncertainty created tremendous fear. Today, when someone develops a fever, most of us assume there is an explanation. Maybe it's a virus. Maybe it's an infection. Maybe it requires medical treatment. Ancient people rarely had that reassurance. Every illness carried a question mark. Would the patient recover? Would the sickness spread? Would the entire community be affected? Nobody knew. As a result, rumors often spread as quickly as disease itself. Some blamed outsiders. Others blamed spirits. Others blamed unusual events in nature. And sometimes people blamed the poor goat that happened to be standing nearby looking suspicious. History has not always been kind to goats. When major epidemics appeared, fear could become overwhelming. Communities searched desperately for answers. Some turned to religion. Some turned to traditional healers. Some tried remedies passed down through generations. A few worked. Many did not. Yet despite all these limitations, ancient healers deserve more credit than they often receive. They observed symptoms. They recorded cases. They shared knowledge. They searched for patterns. Little by little, over hundreds and thousands of years, humanity slowly gathered clues about the nature of disease. The journey was incredibly slow. There were mistakes. There were treatments that probably helped no one except the person selling them. But each generation added a few more pieces to the puzzle. And those pieces eventually led to one of the greatest discoveries in human history: the realization that tiny organisms cause many diseases. That breakthrough was still far in the future. For most people living in the ancient world, sickness remained a mystery wrapped in fear and uncertainty. A cough could be nothing, or it could be the beginning of something deadly. A fever might disappear in a few days, or it might spread through an entire town. Nobody could know for sure, and that uncertainty may have been the most frightening part of all. As we continue our journey through history, we'll explore the diseases that terrified entire civilizations, changed the course of nations, and shaped the lives of millions. Because before modern medicine, disease was not just a health problem. It was one of humanity's greatest fears. Now that we've explored a world where disease was still a mystery, let's travel to one of the darkest chapters in human history. Picture Europe in the year 1347. Stone cities sit behind protective walls. Merchants fill busy marketplaces. Farmers work fields beyond the towns. Church bells ring through narrow streets. Life is far from easy, but for many people it feels familiar and predictable. Nobody knows that something terrifying is already on its way. Far to the east, along the trade routes that connected continents, a deadly disease was spreading. It traveled silently. It needed no army, no king, and no invitation. Instead, it rode with merchants, sailors, carts, and ships. And before long, it would reach Europe. Today we call this disaster the Black Death. At the time, people had no idea what was causing it. Modern scientists believe the disease was a form of plague caused by bacteria carried by fleas that lived on rats. Unfortunately, medieval Europe had plenty of rats. In fact, cities provided everything a rat could want: food, shelter, and very few reasons to leave. The rats probably thought they had found paradise. The humans living nearby would soon disagree. One of the earliest major European outbreaks arrived through trading ports. Ships entered harbors carrying goods from distant lands. But some ships carried more than silk, spices, and valuable cargo. They carried disease. Stories from the time describe ships arriving with crews already dead or dying. In some cases, entire vessels drifted into ports with almost nobody healthy left aboard. It must have been a frightening sight. And things only became worse. Once the plague entered a city, it spread with shocking speed. People began developing symptoms that seemed almost impossible to understand. Many suffered sudden fevers. Others experienced chills, weakness, headaches, and severe pain. Then came one of the most recognizable signs of the disease: swollen lumps called buboes. These painful swellings often appeared in the neck, armpits, or groin. For many people, the appearance of these symptoms was a terrible sign. Death often followed within days. Imagine living in a crowded medieval town. One day your neighbor is perfectly healthy. A few days later, they are gone. Soon another household becomes sick. Then another. Then another. The disease seemed unstoppable. Fear spread faster than any official information could. Not that there was much official information available anyway. Remember, people still did not understand bacteria. Nobody knew exactly how the plague moved from person to person. Without answers, people searched for explanations. Some believed the disease was punishment from God. Others blamed unusual weather. Some thought poisonous air was responsible. Many believed certain groups of people were somehow causing the outbreak. Sadly, fear often leads people to look for someone to blame. Throughout history, outbreaks have frequently been accompanied by rumors, suspicion, and panic. The Black Death was no exception. As death tolls rose, daily life began to break down. Markets became quieter. Businesses closed. Farm fields were abandoned. Families stayed indoors whenever possible. In some cities, entire streets became eerily silent. The normal sounds of everyday life slowly disappeared. People who could afford to leave often fled to the countryside. The problem was that some of them unknowingly carried the disease with them. As a result, the plague followed. Village after village became infected. Town after town suffered losses. There seemed to be nowhere completely safe. For ordinary people, survival often depended on luck. Medical knowledge offered little help. Doctors tried various treatments based on the theories of the time. Some recommended special diets. Others suggested herbal remedies. Bloodletting was also common. If you've listened to enough history stories, you've probably noticed that bloodletting appears surprisingly often. Medieval doctors seem to look at many illnesses and think, perhaps this person needs less blood. Unfortunately, the plague rarely agreed with that plan. Meanwhile, religious processions became common in some regions. Groups of people marched through towns praying for relief. Others carried religious symbols or participated in rituals meant to protect communities from further suffering. When people have no clear answers, they often turn toward faith, tradition, and hope. And during the Black Death, hope was a precious thing. One of the most heartbreaking aspects of the plague was how quickly it separated families. Parents lost children. Children lost parents. Husbands and wives became caregivers almost overnight. Sometimes entire households disappeared within a matter of weeks. The emotional impact was enormous. Many survivors spent the rest of their lives remembering the outbreak. Yet despite the unimaginable losses, life did not completely stop. People continued working when they could. Communities adapted. Survivors helped one another. Human beings proved remarkably resilient, even in the face of catastrophe. By the time the worst wave of the Black Death finally slowed, enormous portions of Europe's population had died. The exact numbers remain debated by historians, but the scale was staggering. Entire communities were transformed. Labor became scarce. Wages changed. Social structures shifted. The plague left marks not only on people but also on economies, governments, and cultures. In many ways, Europe after the Black Death was not the same Europe that had existed before it. The disease had reshaped the continent. And perhaps the strangest part is that nobody living through those years truly understood what was happening. They could see the suffering. They could count the dead. They could feel the fear. But the tiny bacteria responsible remained completely invisible. The true cause would not be discovered for centuries. For medieval people, the plague was a nightmare that seemed to arrive from nowhere and disappear only after taking millions of lives. It became one of history's greatest reminders of how vulnerable humanity can be when facing a disease it does not understand. And sadly, the Black Death would not be the last terrifying illness to leave its mark on the world. In our next chapter, we'll meet another ancient enemy, one that haunted humanity for thousands of years, scarred survivors for life, and killed kings, peasants, and entire populations alike. The disease was smallpox.